Hello, everyone. We've been missing in action for a long time, but we're coming back with a gusto. So today we have Augustine Dickinson from Hamburg, Germany, but he's Canadian. He's going to introduce himself first. And then today we're going to be talking about manuscript studies, about Geʿez studies, and what he's been working on, what he'll be working on, and stuff like that. So first, thank you for giving us opportunity to discuss about your work. So can you just briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I actually started with studying computer science at the University of Waterloo in Canada, which is a rather reputable institution for computer science. Very quickly, I shifted to medieval studies. So a sort of general program that looks at not just studying history, but how to study history. So how to study manuscripts, how to study coins, every kind of archaeology, all these kinds of aspects being sort of drawn together. After that, I did an MA in classical studies, again at Waterloo. And by this point, I had started to teach myself Geʻez and to look at the material from Eritrea and also from Ethiopia and find ways to incorporate that into what I was working on. Then I did another MA in medieval studies again at the University of Toronto, which is where I also continued more seriously in my work on Geʻez. And then most recently, I completed my doctoral dissertation at the University of Hamburg, looking at more specifically Geʻez manuscripts from the 15th century to present, specifically on poetic texts and, of course, with a Christian religious focus as well. Currently now, I'm actually employed in the University of Münster, and so I work for a project called Bahre Hasab, which is looking at computus, calendar, mathematics, and astronomy in Geʻez texts from late antiquity up to the modern day. So this is sort of the trajectory of what I've been working on.
I know people are going to ask you a question. You could have been making money with computer science, and you're going to non-money making venture. So why the change?
It's something that just really I didn't necessarily anticipate, but it just really was captivating to me. I can say as I was starting to teach myself Geʻez, but before I really learned any words, just a few letters and a bit of things, I would listen to these Qaddazi videos, just hours and hours of listening and listening, and I was just completely captivated by it. And so I thought, this is really where I feel, called to work on this kind of literature and this culture. Of course, it's not maybe the most stable career, but I could also already feel right away that it was very rewarding work, very engaging, and you can appreciate the results right away. You look at manuscripts, you look at texts, and you're the first person or one of a few people who have looked at these sometimes. And so there's this real sense of value that you can get right away, as opposed to working on something that just kind of feels meaningless or something that doesn't feel, rewarding or engaging. So for me, this is really a big part of it. And also, I had some time early on in my undergraduate career looking at going to conferences and seeing how academia was done, not just in the classroom, but also at conferences, how scholars interact and how you have debate and discussion. And I thought, really, this feels like a good fit for me. So it's what I've been doing so far.
The passion kicked in, the fire in the belly. Okay, so you mentioned texts and manuscripts. Could you tell our audience what is manuscript? I mean, how would you describe a manuscript for somebody who might have heard the word, but like you mentioned, never touched it or whatever. So what is a manuscript?
Well, so the important part, of course, is that it's something that's written by hand. This is literally where the word comes from in English, also a number of other languages. It emphasizes that this is something that's written by hand. So we have to think that before the advent of printing, and of course, especially in the Horn of Africa, printing came quite late. Everything had to be written by hand. If you wanted a book, you either copied it yourself by hand or you hired someone else who copied it for you. And so this also meant that you prepared the inks yourself, you knew, or whoever was trained to do so did it for you, so they knew the recipes for preparing this. And the same is also true for the writing surface. And in fact, for Christian Ethiopia and Eritrea, the majority are not on paper. We wouldn't call the surface paper. Rather, it's written on parchment, which is prepared from animal skin, similar to leather, but with further treatment and processing so that it's much more stable for writing. And in the end, this is actually a very stable material that lasts for a very long time and is very easily preserved. Unfortunately, it is subject, say, to being eaten by animals or insects or rodents or things like this. But in the end, generally, it lasts better than paper. And so this is why we're fortunate to have parchment manuscripts that survive, over 1,000 years, even over 1,500 years. And this is the aspect of it that's also just amazing, that you go to a library or you go to a monastery and you hold a book in your hand that is unimaginably old, right? Like so many generations have been able to hold this book, and now it comes to you, and it's itself a living part of the history. That's basically sort of in a nutshell what we're working on.
Yeah. Actually, it's very interesting because nowadays all the students use tablets and stuff, and sometimes in my class they don't even have a pen. I ask them, "Do you guys even know what a pen is?" So because now you're talking about somebody who has written by hand and then being kept for 1,000, whatever amount of years, and then we'll talk about the process in a bit later. But so, what do you, as a study, in manuscript studies, what do you study within the manuscripts? What are you looking for besides what you just mentioned, the process?
A key part of what's tied with the study of manuscripts. So it's worth explaining that to study a physical manuscript as an object, how it's made, how it physically is structured, this is called codicology. But for those who are interested in reading manuscripts and working on the contents that they have, this then is philology. So the interesting aspect of it is that because all of the manuscripts are written by hand, it's often the case that you have the same text, the life of a saint, a particular hymn or a poem. And over time, as it gets copied, small changes are introduced, sometimes accidental, sometimes intentionally, sometimes it's based on a political dispute, a religious dispute, whatever, could be the case. And so you can trace from copy to copy how these happen. And so I always describe it as a kind of archaeology that's not looking at something physical, pottery or a building or something, but a text, that you're looking at layers over time of how a text was copied. And it's even more complex because we're not able to rely only on the dating of the manuscript, that this manuscript is from X year and this one is from 100 years later. But because each is copied from another, it can be that a very late manuscript was copied, say, from a very early one. And so this adds to the complexity of it. And so it becomes this kind of puzzle to try to unravel of how the text came to be in the form that we have it. And I think this is very different from our usual perspective, that when we have printed books, because they're mass produced, we have more of a sense of this is right or this is wrong. This book is incorrect and this copy is correct. But generally for people who worked from manuscripts before modern times, there wasn't usually this kind of rigid thinking about it. That's, as long as there's not something that completely alters the meaning, then generally, it's okay. And especially for, say, poetry, which I've worked mostly on, if a word is the same metrically, then what does it matter if it's futari, mehari? The word fits the same in the poem, so it's fine to interchange it, and there's no right or wrong. These are just our own constructs, I would say, in most cases.
So how would you know a copy? Does it mention that it's a copy, or how? Like, for example, in the first edition, second edition, and stuff like that in the print section. But now, so what is it in the manuscript? You said copies. How is it's copied by hand? But do they mention that this is copied, or how would you know it's a copy besides the dates?
The manuscript that has the original text written by the author, this is called the autograph, because auto, like myself, so I'm the one who wrote. This is generally quite rare for Ge'ez. Off the top of my head, I actually personally don't know of any. There are some, maybe I've seen some actually, but generally it's usually the assumption that most of the manuscripts that we have are copies. We have colophons, so a bit of text at the end of a manuscript that says about how it was produced. The question is, in the text itself, does the author say who he or she is? And often it doesn't, and so it can be tricky. There are cases, but usually it's safe to assume that the autograph is lost and we're working with much later copies. Even it's unfortunately the case that for a lot, with some exceptions, we have very few manuscripts that survive from before, say, 1200. So if a text was written before then, most likely we only have a later copy or a copy of a copy or a copy of a copy of a copy and so on.
So let's go back to Ge'ez. You said the Qaddafi was the one that, you're listening for hours and hours, right? So did you know anything about, so does your going to classical studies led you to the Qaddafi, or you knew it at the same time, or the classic, you're talking about European classics, right? So was there a connection there, or?
So I started by reading Latin and Greek literature, of course. Generally, I was myself interested more in early Christian texts and also early Christian theology and the controversies that are connected to that. And so really my first sort of serious encounter with the material was an encyclopedia entry by Getāchew Haile, who's a very famous professor of Ethiopian and Eritrean studies and who cataloged many manuscripts. So I was interested firstly in the controversies that he described happening in the time of King Zärṟa Yaʿəqob and others about different aspects that are well known, whether the Sabbath, how the Sabbath should be observed, how the Trinity, how the persons of the Trinity are connected, and so forth. But also, when I was at Waterloo, my supervisor was a very well-known historian of the history of magic. And this is also an aspect that's well known in Ge'ez literature, so-called azmat, or magical connected or magical religious texts. And so I also was reading some articles on this, and this is inevitably what I did my master's dissertation on. And so this was also a very interesting aspect. Of course, I ended up listening to things like Qaddafi because this is simply what there's the most material of. Now I try more to listen to Mahalet, actually. But I mean, everything that's in Ge'ez is really beautiful, and I find it very harmonious and very melodic to listen to. So I'm happy for most things, actually.
How did Ge'ez come about? Because some people say, it came out of its own. Some there's like Semitic, they intermingled with the indigenous people. I mean, it's still a lot of, I'm sure, what's your understanding of that?
I mean, I'm not a linguist, and it's very, of course, contentious, both academically, but also that it can be rather politically charged. But I think it's not controversial to say that certainly Ge'ez is part of the Semitic language family, so it shares many easily identified cognates with Arabic, with Hebrew, with all of the languages that are of course in this family. Exactly how we connect each of these and if there's common ancestors or sort of in between levels, this is of course contentious, but also we just don't have a huge amount of evidence. In this case, often we're left with stone inscriptions, for example, say from Southern Arabia, from Eritrea, and from northern Ethiopia, but also coins actually. But it's quite sparse and it's hard to work with. Even also this very old material often doesn't have vowels, for example, compared to written Ge'ez, where we have generally vowels are quite common. So it's tricky, but at least we could say that it's clearly at least related to Semitic languages.
Because Ge'ez is used in the church. It's not a living language. It's well, I disagree with it, but they say some people say it's a dead language, even though it's still used. What's your take on that?
There's a beautiful kene composed by Malaka Tzion Haragawain in Toronto. So he says, "Heo yenever le'alem u'motafit uran al botu," that it lives forever and it has no creaturely death. And he has this great interaction with Qasis Fisahat Hadassa, where he says, even if it's not used to buy and sell things in the market, which is one of the aspects we would say if this is a living language or not. We use it to buy and sell knowledge, which I think is very insightful. I think in any case, we can distinguish languages like Ge'ez that are used in the church, not just liturgically, but also scholarly, from truly dead languages, which are languages that are not used in any capacity. So Latin, for example, even if it's not used in any day-to-day communication, the Roman Catholic Church still produces new documents in Latin and use it in the liturgy. And I would say also the same is true, for example, for Church Slavonic, that we still find in Serbia, Bulgaria, Ukraine, and Poland that people are using Church Slavonic both in the church, in the liturgy, and also in production of church documents, even though it's not actually spoken. No one would speak it in a conversation. So we have these really great examples of languages that they're not dead and they're not, you know, actively used, but they're alive in a sense, and they're alive in that they're still production of new material. And of course, in Ge'ez, we have still new Melka'at composed, new Gedels for saints and so forth. So always there's more.
How many in Europe, for example, how many, or anywhere else, how many, do you know how many universities teach Ge'ez as, in Hamburg, is the manuscript specifically Ge'ez, or is just manuscript studies, but Ge'ez is part of it?
Hamburg, it's fortunate in some ways, but the history is unfortunate that Hamburg, the university began as an institute for colonial studies, because at the time Germany, of course, had many colonies in Africa. So it has a very strong linguistic focus. And so for this reason, at Hamburg University, they're able to teach not just Ge'ez, but also Tigrinya and Amharic as well. I understand now at Münster, they're offering Ge'ez taught. And I've heard of it being taught at other universities in Europe, but I don't believe that it's a regular offering. It's very situationally dependent if there's someone who's able to teach it and if there's an interest in having it as a class. At Toronto, the University of Toronto, they're fortunate that they have an endowment specifically for the teaching of Ge'ez. So they have now several years of consistent teaching for Ge'ez. Also, there had been at the Catholic University of America in DC. I don't know if it is currently, but also some other universities in the United States. But unfortunately, it is much more rare than most languages like Latin or Greek or so, where it's quite easy to find instruction in this.
Have you done how many manuscripts are in Eritrea, for example, or do we know exactly how many manuscripts there are, or in Eritrea or outside Eritrea that are located?
That's an interesting question. I don't know. Aklilu would know better than me, but I don't know if there's been an estimate. I know, so at least for Ethiopia, there are suggested estimates, but it's difficult because it's hard to get a sense if you go to a monastery of exactly how many manuscripts they have, especially because these are precious objects. So you maybe don't want to just give away, I have this many, and of course, also there are always more being produced. And also, of course, we have many that are now in foreign collections, in European libraries and in North American libraries. These are, I suppose, easier to count because those numbers are generally public. At least I can say for manuscripts, for Ge'ez, there's substantially more than for many other languages. Certainly for manuscripts that are pre-modern, I think they're maybe not as old as I said earlier, but there's a much greater wealth. For most of the texts that I look at, often there can be a very large number of manuscripts. Sometimes even I've compared one text across 40 manuscripts, which is a huge task. It's a lot of material. So I would say that working on Ge'ez, we're quite fortunate in this regard that we have so many manuscripts. And I might predict one of your questions, but also many of them, fortunately, have been photographed or digitized in some way. And so this also makes them more accessible now, fortunately for us, that I can look at 20 manuscripts of the same text while sitting in my office because they've all been photographed and made accessible for research.
So what do they have in, what are the contents? Is it just spiritual, theological, or does it have social history about the area, or what do they? I think people always think about the codex or the manuscripts that are in the monasteries relate to spiritual, but land issues and stuff like that. So what are the contents, or some of them, or?
Yeah, I mean, so we find everything that people found useful to copy. So of course, the literary tradition is closely tied to the Christian church, and especially to monastic contexts. So this does skew the amount of material, that most of it is religious, of course, especially many biblical books, also theological works, monastic works, but also we find examples of poetry. This is what I worked on, liturgical materials. And we have also, of course, historiographies or historiographic literature. So chronicles, all kinds of different biographies. And then also we do find social records, so things like land donations or donations of property, purchases, but these are often not in a single book, so to say, or a single codex. Often they're written in margins or in the backs of books on loose pages, and these end up attached to manuscripts because the manuscript, especially for example, gospel manuscripts, if your monastery has this beautiful, say even covered in silver, large gospel manuscript, you know, everyone knows where this is, and it's the most guarded and protected thing. So then if you also don't want to lose your record of some kind of contract or business that you've conducted, it's sensible to put it there where it's also the most protected thing, rather than to, you know, have a book just for say purchase records or land transfers or something like this, and then someone just knows they can steal this little book that has that information. Rather, it's in this big gospel manuscript, which of course also is protected by its sanctity, that no one would want to violate or to desecrate such a holy book.
You mentioned loose pages, so I thought they were bound, right? How are they loose pages?
Well, of course, manuscripts are sewn together with thread and with needles. And because of this, as opposed to modern books, right, which are just glued in with adhesive,
Yeah.
they also become, in their own sense, living objects that as needed, they can cut the strings, sew in new things. They can also repair if it gets damaged. And so this is again part of this codicological study, that we can train ourselves on how to understand that, you know, it wasn't just made and then that was it, but it was made and then something got ripped out and needed to be sewn back in. And then they wanted to add something, so they sewed this in. And so it becomes on its own an object with its own history and its own life that we can tell, even independent of the textual contents that it has.
Makes it literally a living document.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but that segues to the process. How is it made, if you can tell us briefly? I mean, you know, what kind of leather?
I mean, it's a long process,
ink.
of course, from start to finish.
But briefly.
And then I'm also not such an expert, but of course we start with the animal skin, we scrape it down and clean it from the hair, from the fat, from whatever other kinds of things we have. It gets stretched and dried so that it becomes rigid and also usually clearer to write on. We have the ink is prepared usually from charcoal from a fire. The pages are usually written before they're bound, because of course it's easier to write on a loose page than it is to write in a book that's already put together. And then they're stitched together usually with 2 needles, if I'm not mistaken, for each of the sewing stations. And so you basically take what are called quires. So, you know, say 4 pages, or I should say 4 sheets folded together. And then this forms 1 quire, and then multiple quires are sewn together to make a codex. And you can see this also with modern books, that if you look at the spine, you can see that there's sort of these little booklets that all collectively make up the big book. It's the same for manuscripts. The only difference is that they're usually hand sewn rather than being glued in. And then, of course, we also have the cover. There's different options for how covers get produced and how they get attached. But traditionally, we have wooden covers, often also with leather coverings. But again, this depends on the the object itself, how much money was being spent on its production, how it was going to be preserved, and so forth.
And it has the design, and I've seen some with red in the beginning and then black. Does it signify anything, or is just
Yes, you mean in the text. So of course,
in the text? Yeah.
yes, this is a custom called rubrication. So that's the names, especially holy names, so the names of God, of Mary, of saints, are written in red ink. Also, it can be used organizationally, so that the beginning of sections of a work, the beginning of a line of poetry, these kind of things also end up being written in red. So it's very practical that when you want to look through something, you can find quickly where the sections are or where the lines are and so forth, based on this. Also, there's a decorative aspect too. So often, for example, at the very beginning, they might have a few lines that are entirely written in red, or they sort of skip one, red, black, or something like this, just as a way to make it a bit more ornate. And of course, this is not strictly necessary in terms of from a practical aspect, but I think we all appreciate the aesthetics of a well prepared, of a beautiful book. If it has a nice decorative design in the heading, if it has this kind of thing, we appreciate it more. It's not practically necessary, but it adds to they call it here the aura. That's to the aura of the object.
So highlights, OCR, all of that is included because in modern term, right? So you mentioned earlier. So do you know how the manuscripts at Hamburg or Toronto or Princeton or Munster or the Catholic University of America came up with these manuscripts?
Unfortunately, it's well known in a number of cases that they end up being looted. This is well documented in some cases that I will be careful about how I word what I say. But unfortunately, this does happen, that they end up either being stolen or looted, depending on the context. But I would emphasize that this is not necessarily the case for every manuscript that ends up abroad. There are examples that are legitimately purchased, and of course we can have a sort of ethical debate about whether it's ethical, even if it's purchased with money, to take it away from the country of origin. This is a whole ethical debate. But even aside from this, we have also records of cases where Europeans came to Ethiopia or to Eritrea, and they commissioned the production of a new manuscript for themselves that they were interested in. They found a copy of a text that they were interested in, and rather than attempt to purchase this, they actually paid for the new production of the parchment, the ink, and had this copied for themselves. And so I would argue that in such cases, it's basically the most ethical it could be for it to have arrived in Europe, that it wasn't either taken illicitly or with some kind of problematic aspect, but it was legitimately produced just for the European or American or whoever to take back for study. And I say, even though it's unfortunate that so many of these heritage objects do end up abroad, it also gives a chance for those of us who aren't able to travel to appreciate these objects for ourselves. And I would really emphasize that in many libraries, the University of Toronto Library, the British Library, you don't have to be a Ph.D. scholar to be able to access these actually. You can, as an ordinary member of the public with a library card, often have access to these manuscripts. Of course, hopefully you get some training on how to be careful and how to handle them safely, but they're not hidden away from people. And I encourage, and I know librarians, for example, again at Toronto, who encourage members of the public to come and to see, not just say Geʻez, also Latin or Greek or whatever, to see how it is to hold, a 12th century or 15th century book for yourself, and to appreciate that, we have these modern books now, but here's, really what we had for so many centuries. So this is my encouragement.
Yeah. Okay. So you said you're studying at the beginning. You mentioned that you're studying the Bahre Hasab or Geʿez Computus or astronomy, right, of ancient times. What more can you tell us about that? Because it's interesting. So how is it? What can you tell us about that? And
well, the first and most important aspect of Computus, of course, is calculating Easter, Fasika. And it's an arithmetical process. It's attributed to an Egyptian bishop, although actually it's a bit more complicated historically. But we have this beautifully arithmetical process where we start from the year and we understand the cycle of how the moon and the sun are in a regular dissonance, right? That a lunar year and a solar year are not the same, but after a certain number of cycles, they realign, so to say. So all of this comes from understanding at which point we are in the cycle, and then based on that, how do we calculate the correct number of days to start from and end up at Easter being on a Sunday. But aside from this is not the only sort of example that we have that touches on this. Also, we have, for example, shadow tables. So these are tables which explain at which time of day. So how to say, like, from the length of your own shadow, can you approximate what hour of day it is? And of course, this is also useful in a religious context, that at a monastery we have prayers at regular intervals. So matins, vespers, these are how these are called in English. And so we can determine the hour even simply based on approximately the length of our shadow. So this is also, for example, an aspect that we have. We have also astrological literature explaining how the signs of the zodiac move, also on the gates of how the sun travels, how the sun slightly varies, right? I mean, it always rises in the east and sets in the west, of course, but it's not often at true east. It moves a little bit as the year progresses, and this was tracked by people in ancient times already. And so all of this ends up being preserved in literature for us.
So following up on that, so the famous computus in Eritrea is the Hisab Bizem, right, from the monastery, which is considered the oldest in the region. So can you say a little more about this? Have you seen it, and then the relationship with the computers out of Egypt?
I have to confess, I'm aware of Hasab Bizan and everyone talks about it, but I've yet for someone to show me an exact text that can be called, this is Hasab Bizan, and then I can compare it to others. But at least I can say that there clearly was an awareness of not just that there are different calendar systems. So already in Ge'ez, we find very clear references to the Julian calendar and the Hebrew calendar, although this is actually quite complicated in what is actually referred to. And then also different means of calculating Easter. There's discussions of how Romans have done it versus how it's done by Agazi or by Ge'ez speakers. And so in this way, I find that it's really quite fascinating that we want, maybe there's a tendency to say that people had a kind of limited awareness, but really we find in Ge'ez, this is one of the things I'm working on right now, an exact discussion of how to convert from the Ge'ez calendar to the Julian calendar. And people were aware of this. And it's not only in this high level sense. I have an article that's in preparation that looks at how even this is discussed in poetry. I have poetry examples, that are sung poetry that discusses, this day in the Ge'ez calendar is this day in the Julian calendar. Or when the leap year comes, of course, that every 4 years we have a day that's added to the calendar. Here's how that's done. This is discussed in poetry even, right? So it's not only a kind of scientific book where it wouldn't be accessible to everyone, but we have also this other kind of literatures that preserve the same knowledge, which I think is also quite fascinating.
So does your study also include the copies were plagiarized or substitution of characters or history of history? Like, would there be any in your study? Did you find anything like that?
Well, I would question, what does plagiarism mean? Because we look at this from a very modern time when we have copyright law and intellectual rights, but in pre-modern societies, it's quite normal to quote and not even give the source. I mean, not to say, for example, from the Bible, that you don't even say, well, Paul wrote in this letter, da da da. You just say an apostle wrote, and then you quote it, right? This is, from our modern perspective, a kind of plagiarism, but there wasn't attached to it this kind of monetary value. No one produced a text with the expectation that this text would be a commodity that they would sell, right? So having someone copy by hand a text that you wrote isn't somehow plagiarizing or stealing, right? If someone is copying, the life of a saint, you're thankful that there are more copies of the life of that saint to praise them. If you have again, a computational work, why would you imagine that someone else shouldn't be able to copy it? It's knowledge that's needed for everyone. And so this is also why when we transcribe manuscripts, this isn't either a kind of stealing. This is knowledge that's available. It exists before copyright. And of course, also many of these works are anonymously produced from the beginning, because there wasn't a focus on individualism, that I produced this and my name will be preserved forever as the person who produced this work, but rather the focus is on the intentionality of the text, whether it's religious and so it's meant to praise God and so there's no need for me to be praised as the person who produced it, or because it has a general value, a historical value, something like this. And so there's no need to jealously guard it, but rather to share it openly. This is what I would say.
So, I mean, that brings it to digitization. So do you think the manuscript should be digitized so that it's more accessible, even though the monasteries might think, or guard it? What do you think? I know the University of Minnesota, where Professor Getachew Haile used, they did digitize a lot of that, of codex and stuff. So what do you think for?
So the digitization, one of the most important aspects is not just access, but also preservation. There's cases of manuscripts where they were photographed multiple times, either intentionally or unintentionally, with, say, a decade in between, and you see how it deteriorates. I've seen personally cases where parts of a manuscript that were described in a catalog were no longer there by the time it was photographed, for example. So the ultimate means of preserving this really is by having these digital copies, and especially, as you say, in Minnesota, where they're very diligent about having also physical copies on microform and all kinds of storage and digital backups and things like this. Of course, this needs to be done also in an ethical way. And so, at least, for example, the case in Minnesota, they always gave copies to the institutions. Again, this is questionable, in a monastery, will they use some microfilm or something like this? So we need to be sensitive to the concerns of those who rightfully possess the objects, of course. Also, that if there's an aspect of respect, right, for a religious object, for something that's venerated. But insofar as these are valuable and for heritage and for culture, the best way that we can preserve these for the future, because they shouldn't just be something for us, they should be for everyone in the future, for all of humanity, ideally. Really, it's good then to have these digitized and made available. I come back to the beginning that you say, why did I choose this field where it's not going to be very profitable? So, working by having digitized manuscripts, I'm not becoming a millionaire in this. I'm doing it because this is something that I feel passionate about, that this is work that needs to be preserved, and not just also preserved, but accessible. As I said, I worked especially on poetry, and I've seen poems that have never been published anywhere in Ge'ez, in any form. So I can assume that almost no one ever saw them. But someone produced this, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, someone produced this, and there's aspects of it that are beautiful. And it's a shame if I'm the only person and one other person who's seen the manuscript is the only person who's ever seen it. This is why I really do all of my best to publish things online, even openly. I publish also with translations, because I would like to see that people, even who don't read Ge'ez, are able to see the beauty that I see in the literature, and which I believe is there inherently, that it's inherently beautiful.
I mean, some people we work with, they say, they do a lot of work and help us with computers and stuff like that. And I asked them, okay, what is the value we put money into it? They said, no, you can't put monetary value for passion. So I agree with that, what you just said. So it's important that I just raised it because people say, why you're in computer science and you moved to this. I know that that's not the question, because we had other guests, and they mentioned the same thing. I was in here and moved to them. They're like, the first thing they ask is why do you do that? But I think now you answered it right there. So let me take you back to the Qaddaси you mentioned. In the Ge'ez, in the Qaddaси, there are little notes, they're like a circle or like cheret or something where when you sing, you go over or stuff like that. So are they musical notes, or what can we call them musical notes? The little signs that you see when in the Ge'ez.
Yeah, so of course these are called millikit.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is that, so of course, some of the simple signs, as you said, are indications of intonation or how they're chanted, visually. But of course, in most cases, they are written words, which are referential, so that you have a base chant, which is very well known, and then you take the words from this and you write them smaller as a sign that this text is chanted the same as this other thing that is well known. In this way, I think it's generally agreed that the millikit system is an actual invention of Ge'ez speakers, that they weren't influenced by others. It's never impossible to say, because we have, of course, also musical notation developed separately in the Latin West and also in the Greek or the Byzantine system. But in any case, it does also map with similar chant notation systems in other Christian traditions, because of course everyone has the same question of how do I make sure that this is chanted correctly, in a written way, as not just mentally. But of course also the challenge is that for the teaching schools, for Qaddazi Beit, for Yaʿəqob Beit, there is also this huge oral component as well. And this is also, again, to come back to the topic of preservation, part of the challenge, that for many aspects, we don't have a written history, we only have an oral history that's preserved. For example, because I work on poetry, I had a lot of connections to Yaʿəqob Beit, and for some things, we simply don't have any written historical record, only oral practice, and which again also then requires either speaking Tigrinya or Amharic and being able to visit an Yaʿəqob Beit and have the teacher explain to you how they have the practice. So this is sort of how it goes.
For the poetry, do you know any, or can you recite a short Ge'ez poem, for example?
I have one.
You mentioned poetry a couple of times. You mentioned poetry, so people will be surprised to hear a Ge'ez poem.
So I can say my dissertation was on Melke, which I think is well known, but also I've been working on Nigs and Artke. So I can think of one that I'm quite fond of for its layers of interpretation. So it goes, Yibay Nabi Ma'amr Hadifito et Kabar Tabibni Arhano Lenoh and Bahar. Tabibni Christos Bequer Mariam Yeti Mismak Christian Mesker Ente Batida Hanu Amat Ayan Meder. So that it begins with a quotation from the Wisdom of Solomon. So she steered the ship, Hadifito Etikabr, the ship of honor. And then it's explained in the next line that Tabib, wisdom, saved Noah. So that wisdom is the one who steered the ship, referring, of course, to the ark. And then it explains in the following lines, Tabibni Christos Bequer, so that the wisdom is Christ. So already we have these kind of two layers, that the wisdom is what steered the boat, and then the wisdom is Christ. And Mary, Mariami Etim is Maka Christian Meskat. Mary is the foundation or the base of the boat. And this ties because this stanza is actually for Kinana Mehret on Yekatit 16. So this connects that Mary then is representational of the boat in which Noah was saved. And then this is the final line, that Mary is, or the church, again, of course, also both aspects, is that in which we were saved from the flooding of the earth. So I think it's both beautiful that it's well composed and the meter and in the rhyme, but it has this amazing layer of interpretation and subtext.
So the article you mentioned that is going to come out, where can we, when is it coming out, and where can, for people who have access?
It should be open access. I try as best as I can. I don't know exactly where it will appear. It will be on Computus and calendars in liturgical poetry. But I can say already I have an article that's appeared in Ethiopica, which is open access online. It's called Melka Arsima, Image of Hribsame, an Ethiopic hymn for an Armenian saint. So it presents the text and translation of the oldest version of Melka Arsima for the saint Arsima or Arsema or Hribsame. And in the same journal in Ethiopica, a colleague of mine and I, we have an article that would appear next year on a different Melk, so Melka Alem, which is a rather interesting case, a Christian hymn about the secular world. So in the end, it actually condemns the secular world, which is very quite interesting. And I have also a few others that will appear. If you search my name, I'm sure they'll come up. So I can say in the meantime, I do also have a website for those who are interested in Melk. It's just melkagubae.com. I can spell it later, of course, to appear in titling. And this is really my work from my doctoral work to have an authoritative list of all Melk that have been produced. By the next update, it'll have just over 610, which is far more than anyone had ever identified before. If I can say, I'm quite a bit proud of it, that there's many saints that are quite unknown, which are only, very, very difficult to find in one manuscript or two manuscripts. So this is also available, and I'm happy if anyone will use it. They're free to access it and use it as they wish. This is, as I said, it's meant to be a resource. It's meant to be for everyone and for preservation. So
thank you so much for this wonderful, very exciting conversation, and also for if you can, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I want to say also thank you very much. It's really been my pleasure. And I want to follow up just briefly, if I may, on something you said.
Sure.
I have this in the acknowledgements in my master's dissertation, actually, that when I was starting to teach myself Ge'ez, I wasn't only listening to videos, but I also went to the Eritrean church in my community. So this was in Kitchener, Ontario, Mariam. And I can say, really, I never had encountered such a welcoming community. I say in my acknowledgements that it's a true example of ksenia. I have it written in Greek, but ksenia in Greek is the idea of you never turn a guest away. When a guest comes to you, you treat them as if they belong to your family, and you lavish them, and you give them so much respect. And I really appreciate that among Eritreans right from the beginning. I was the only Ferengi to come into their church. I didn't understand what was going on, but I did my best to learn over time. I was immediately always very welcomed. I grew also to know other members, also from London, Ontario, and from Toronto. And so I really absolutely appreciate that this is such an ingrained part of the culture and a valued part of the culture, that someone like me can show up and be immediately welcomed and warmly received, rather than just, he's a stranger, we're not interested in him, but that I'm always, made to feel very welcome, and I really sincerely appreciate it. So this is why I'm very excited for Eritrea, because I know it will be exactly the same when I get there. So
yeah, you'll get a lot of ksenia there. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, we'll talk once you return from Eritrea. Okay, thank you so much.